So with that, I think the last topic for today, let us talk about continuous integration and continuous deployment. And this is a major change from the way that software used to be released. This is a snapshot from the Windows 95 launch party. As you can see, the clothing taste of people who use Windows hasn't changed since then. I'm just kidding. I kid because I love. But the launch party for Windows 95 was huge. I don't know if any of you know the classic Rolling Stones song, Start Me Up. Microsoft actually paid to license that song to play it to kick off the launch party. And the reason is because Windows 95 was the first version of Windows that had the little start button in the lower right corner. For those of you who don't use Windows, the start button is the one that you hit when you want to stop using your computer. I'm punchy this morning. Anyway, the point is releases used to be a big deal. Releasing a piece of software was something worthy of having an event. Now, releases are so frequent that most users of a site literally don't notice when releases are happening. Amazon, for example, they do several deploys of their site per week. Not necessarily the entire site gets refreshed, but specific pieces of the site, specific services are being refreshed all the time. Remember how we said at the beginning of class that one of Jeff Bezos's early missives is all of the different parts of Amazon had to be done as service-oriented architecture. So anytime somebody revs one of those services, it could affect the overall Amazon service. Stack Overflow. I'm sure many of you have used Stack Overflow to search for answers to coding problems. According to its co-founder, they do multiple deploys per day, rolling out little features here and there. Similarly, GitHub, they do tens of deploys per day, modifying or enhancing or trying out different features. That's from Zach Holman, one of the GitHub engineers who was a guest speaker in this class a few years ago. And in all these cases, when you think about it, it kind of makes sense, right? If you remember the whole framing of Agile and certainly of extreme programming is if something is a good idea, then do that thing to the greatest extreme possible. Here, the good idea is the risk that you did something wrong. Something wrong could be that you introduced a bug, or it could be that you introduced something that isn't a bug, but your users don't like. And so the more often you do that, the smaller each change is, the less you have screwed up in some sense, right? The less you have to back out in order to undo the effects of your bad thing. So what does this tell us in terms of an agile approach to deployment? Basically, it means that just like development, deployment should be a non-event. It should not be a special thing that has, banners waving and licensing music from famous rock and roll bands. It should be something that is so mundane, so automated that it's basically a non-event. It's just something that happens all the time. It's part of the regular workflow, just like checking in code. So to do that, as we've seen, one of the success stories of software engineering is make things automated. Make it so that instead of doing a thing, you write a program that does the thing, and then you can run the program consistently every time you need. And indeed, most platform as a service sites like Heroku already do something like this. There's tools that do it for, self-hosted sites, but Heroku deployment automation is what? You say you git push and, you maybe clear out your database, but that's all you have to do. You don't manually have to do any other deployment steps. And Heroku even has a button, although many of you, maybe in this class, you haven't used it, but one of the Heroku pages actually has a button that says roll back. So if your app was working and you pushed a new deployment and something broke, there's literally a button you can press, and within 15 seconds, the previously deployed version of the app is back up and running again. Undo is a really good feature to have. It's basically like an undo button for deploys. So continuous integration is about integration testing the app beyond what each developer does. You have a set of tests that anytime somebody is committing new code, those tests always run, and they might be either too expensive for each developer to run, or they might run in an environment that is different from what the developer has. For example, to the extent that there are differences in, let's say, the database that is used by Heroku versus by my development platform, I might want a set of tests that does a bunch of stuff in a very similar environment, right? In fact, I might want some that runs in a separate app on Heroku that's just maybe provisioned a little smaller. So these are things that can happen automatically every time somebody pushes code or merges code into the main branch, but things that are either too expensive or for other reasons not appropriate for individual developers to do as part of their individual development process. The most common strategy for this is you set up something like a GitHub action so that every time there's either a push to a branch or a merge to a branch, there is some set of jobs that gets kicked off and sort of runs in the background, and eventually it produces a report. The report could be, there's a little GitHub badge on your page, and the badge is sort of updated each time the job runs. You can have the job send you email or otherwise notify you or send a message into your Slack channel. But basically, the ongoing rhythm is every time I change the repo, like the main repo where my team's code lives, something happens that is sort of a quality assurance check for things that I might have missed. And so I get notified almost immediately if something got broken. So again, reasons to do this, differences between development and production environments. You might have a CI environment that is closer to the production environment and so might catch some things you might otherwise miss. Another big one is cross-browser testing. If you've got a lot of sort of interactive features and you need to make sure they work with different versions of a browser or browsers from different companies, there are services that will do this. They will run your app in multiple different headful or headless browsers and sort of send you not only a report of what happened, but if you want, like a little movie, watching the app as it's being tested by these different browser front ends. Again, that's something that wouldn't really be practical for individual developers to do. If your app integrates with external services, you might want to have some tests that are actually run against the service sandbox. So we talked about when you're developing locally, and you're testing part of your code that would normally interact with a remote interface, usually it makes the most sense to find different ways to stub that out so that you're not really making an API call. But as we heard from our guest speaker, Casey, there are cases where actually running your tests where you're doing real requests, but in a controlled manner. For example, if you use Stripe for payment processing, Stripe has a test mode where you can do real transactions, but no money changes hands. All the results are the same. You really do the communication. You get the real responses, but it's basically all happening with fake money. So again, that's something that as a sort of final smoke check that everything's working, you could do in CI, but maybe you don't do it as part of every single developer's local testing because that would increase the number of times that you're hammering the test servers. Protection against attacks. A thing you might do in your CI environment is try attacking your app in a few different ways. We're going to talk about some of those ways in one of the upcoming modules. But again, you can sort of, put your app in a cage and throw things at it in a CI environment in a way that wouldn't really be pleasant or practical to do on your own environment. Stress testing and longevity testing. Like the anecdote that I just told you, some conditions only show up after a long time or under very specific cases. In CI, you can set up an extended sort of stress testing run. You can do things like ramp up the number of requests per second until you see that the app has trouble and make sure that that's at an acceptable level for what you think your user traffic might be. And as an example, when we started doing this class, I went out and talked to a few companies that were sort of really serious about CI at a time when it wasn't yet cool. Salesforce CI runs over 150,000 tests every time that somebody checks in code. And if a test fails, it automatically opens a bug report and assigns it to the person whose code check-in caused that particular test to fail. So that's, to me, that's the epitome of automation, right? It's actually using the entire workflow up to and including filing a bug report to get the test to pass again. Related to this is continuous deployment. If you are really confident of your CI environment, meaning that if your CI tests all pass, you are really confident that the app is ready for prime time, it does not need to be tested by a human being any further, then you just make that part of the CI. So whenever you push, CI runs, and if CI passes, that automatically causes the app to deploy without you doing a manual deployment. And again, GitHub and Heroku, for example, have integrations that support this. You can set it up so that if the CI workflow passes, the next thing that happens automatically is it gets pushed to Heroku and the app gets restarted. So does that all mean that, the idea of a software release has no value anymore? Not quite. I think this process is great to use for what I'll call releases that are largely invisible to the customer. You're enhancing or adding small bits of functionality here and there. But there are things like customer visible milestones. Like there's a major new feature of your app and your continuous deployment is putting the code in place that supports different parts of the feature. But there's a moment when you sort of turn on the feature in a way that makes it visible in the UI. From the user's point of view, that's a difference because now it translates to a difference in how they use the app or the value that they get from using the app. So from that point of view, feature releases and things like that may still be a valuable thing to talk about with the customer. One way to manage these is that you can use git tag to attach symbolic names to particular sets of git commits. And so the last time you released, this was the release that made that feature visible to the user. And then you can sort of go back in time to figure out what other things happened in there. So that's the idea behind continuous integration, continuous deployment. A lot of what goes into continuous integration really is the same as what you've been doing in your development environment, which is you have a set of Cucumber specs, you have a set of RSpec specs, and you sort of run the whole battery of those. That's not the only thing you can do, but that's a fine starting point for CI. right? If your starting point is just that you automate that using something like GitHub Actions, and you have a little badge or a set of badges on your project that shows most recent CI passed, test coverage passed, that's sort of the first step towards getting into this mindset of testing is not a thing you do separately. Testing is part of the workflow. And if you really trust your tests, deployment becomes part of the workflow as well. You can automate it just like you automate everything else.